India has taken a giant leap towards the goods and services tax with the Rajya Sabha in a rare show of strong bipartisan convergence, approving the tax reform measure first considered almost 30 years ago. Once implemented, it is expected to do away with the multiple indirect taxes, make the economy more efficient, and transform the country into a single market. Joining me now to discuss the impact is Rajiv Chandrasekhar. He's MP of the Rajya Sabha. Good morning, Mr. Chandrasekhar. It's a pleasure to have you, as always, on the show. Let's start off with your first reactions. As far as the proceedings in the Rajya Sabha went on, and more importantly, for starters, let's focus on the kind of fiscal federalism that has been focused on. Do you think that a lot has been given, a lot of accommodation has been made for the states?
No, I think, look, that was inevitable, because when you are amending a constitution that effectively is impacting the state's sovereign right to tax, there will be a need for a consensus around what the new model will be. And so to those who say that this bill is imperfect and those who say that there has been a little too much give for the states, that is really the cost of consensus building as we try and create a large common Indian market and create an economic integration of the states into this large market with all of its benefits. So I wouldn't worry too much about an extra give to the state, but they are the ones who are making that extra step to move into a regime where they give up taxation powers and rights to tax and move to a GST regime.
Right. Mr. Chandrasekhar, is the fear of a higher rate a little misplaced? Is the finance minister of that view?
Yeah, and I said that in Parliament yesterday in response to the former finance minister's statement about the cap. It has to be capped at 18%. I said, look, I don't understand why there is this misplaced concern about taxes being high. The people who have to decide the tax are finance ministers of various states and the central government. These are all political people and who understand that a high tax is anti-consumer. The entire rationale for the GST rests on it being pro-consumer, pro-small business. And so it just defeats the purpose if somebody then comes and says, let's have high GSTs. So it is inconceivable in my mind, and I think it's a red herring and it's a waste of our time to even ponder a scenario where there will be high GSTs. It is clear that there may be in the early days, as the tax net is small, because we have alcohol out, we have tobacco out, we have petroleum out. It may be, as the net is small, that early days the tax may be slightly closer to the 18, 19, 20%. But over time and very rapidly, I believe the GST will moderate into a much more lower, more affordable tax, which is really the way indirect taxes in this country should go, which is affordable with a wider base and wider compliance. And that is precisely the resolution that the empowered finance ministers group has said, that they want the GST to be a moderate tax that will be advantageous to the consumers.
Right. Mr. Chandrasekhar, a point well taken, and there is, of course, merit in that argument that you make, that it will be a self-defeating purpose for states to put in place a higher tax rate. So in that, do you think that it is a failed argument, and some states that are on the side of northwards of a 20% tax rate will find themselves in a difficult spot, and ultimately it would their efforts would turn to naught?
Yeah, absolutely. Because look, the government of India in this bill has committed to 5 years to maintain the revenue neutrality for all states. So really there is no incentive anywhere in this constitutional amendment for states to go jack up the GST to high levels. So if they moderate it, their consumers benefit. And if there is a revenue loss from that moderation, the government of India steps in and backstops them. So nowhere in this equation do I see an incentive for state governments or indeed the union government to increase the GST.
Mr. Chandrasekhar, as far as the efforts now going ahead from here are concerned, and possibly this is the more difficult leap in the entire effort to attainment of GST, 2 or 3 things. One is the dispute resolution mechanism. One is the council itself, the constitution of the council, the powers of the council, and the authorities of the council, and one is the revenue neutral rate, which is obviously the most controversial. How much of an effort do you think, and what kind of an effort do you think needs to go in the next 3 months to build consensus around these elements? Because the consensus for the constitutional amendment was one, but possibly now the bigger challenge is over the next 3 months. Do you think the 3-month timeline is attainable?
No, look, I think, you know, we know how India works, and I think when we all put our mind to it, we can come up with, you know, miracles. And it is when we don't want to achieve an objective that we tend to prevaricate and obfuscate. I think clearly in this case today, after yesterday's decision, it is clear that most political parties, if not all, want GST to happen at the earliest. Most state governments want to move and migrate to GST. So given that, I have no reason to believe that we cannot pull this off in the next 3 to 6 months. And in my opinion, the most important issue for the government is a discovery of what would be that base GST rate. And for that, there needs to be, the GST Council needs to sit and meet, look at all of the numbers that are on the table. There is a CEA's note, the Chief Economic Advisor's note that talks about a certain rate, but his assumption set is all over the place. So we have to sit down and almost from square one, go back to discovering what that base rate should be. And I think that is the most important milestone for this. The technology backbone, the legislative backbone in terms of getting the legislative calendar, in terms of getting the GST bill passed in Parliament, getting the constitutional amendment ratified by state assemblies, I think those will happen pretty much automatically, and the 3-month time frame is fine. But to get to the GST Council, crunching those numbers, coming up with those slabs, coming up with the base rate, those are the real challenges, and I think that the sooner we start, the better.
Right. Mr. Chandrasekhar, let's talk about the GST Council itself. Now, coming back again to the point of higher rates being proposed by certain states and them not being happy with an 18% R&R, do you feel that the centre having the final veto in the GST Council will work in favour going ahead?
No, I think we have to understand the veto. The way the veto works in the GST Council is the states have a veto as the centre has a veto. It's not so much a veto as much as states and centre have to both agree.
Timeline now look realistic. So what's the government stance? How quickly can you go through with the legislation?
Well, all efforts will be made, and with the cooperation of everyone concerned, I think we'll meet the deadline.
Right. So, now that we've got 3 major pieces of legislation going forward, how will the government look to perhaps bring those in? Will the winter session be the time when all of these legislations come in?
I think what has happened yesterday is a major step forward, and it shows that consensus building is possible.
Right.
And I think the system has exhibited immense maturity in taking this big step, especially because this happens to be the silver jubilee year of the economic reforms.
Finally, sir, you've got major debates around the GST rate, and of course, the possible inflationary impact of a high GST rate. How do you view these concerns at this point, sir?
I think, as it was clarified in the debate also, that this is just the laying of the foundation, and the council, which has representation of all the states, they will deliberate on all these issues, and they will take the best decision which is in public interest.
Right. There are some discussions between centre and state on the threshold. There is still no agreement on that front, sir. And also on the, of course, issue, of the dual control as well. How do you see these concerns? How do you see these being resolved, sir? Do you the centre agree to 1.5?
I think everybody is concerned about the impact of GST, and citizens, I think, rightly should be concerned about what the impact of this far-reaching reform is going to be on their lives and on the economy as such. But as I said, that this is something which is a work in progress, and things will resolve themselves by and by. Thank you so much.
All right. Awfully sorry, Mr. Chandrasekhar, to have cut you short and interrupted there, but we have the Finance Secretary whose bite was coming in, and obviously he was speaking about the broader contours going ahead, as also what he makes of the passage of the Constitutional Amendment Bill. Anyway, you were speaking about the veto power in the GST Council of the Centre and the states. Explain to us, is it non-rival and non-intrusive in that sense? Is that what you were trying to say? Please continue.
No, I was saying that I don't think you should read this as a veto as much as the GST Council's architecture implies that unless the states and the centre or the centre and the state both agree on pretty much everything to do with GST, you don't have a progress. So it in a sense imposes a discipline of consensus building between the states and the centre. It is not about the centre. There is no incentive for the centre to say we don't like what the states do, so we'll just sit on it. Similarly, there's no incentive for the states to say we don't like what the centre says, so we just sit on it. There is no incentive for deadlocking, but there is an incentive for consensus building, negotiation, talking, discussion, which is really the hallmark of GST. GST yesterday got passed in the Rajya Sabha not because it was one person's idea or another person's idea, or one person initiated and the other person blocked it. It happened only because everybody around the table came together to support what was good, what is significant in terms of a taxation reform. And that is really the DNA of how GST and the GST Council will have to function going forward.
Right, understood, Mr. Chandrasekhar. Also, a lot has been spoken about the GST being introduced, the bill being introduced as a money bill as opposed to a finance bill. And Mr. Chidambaram also said that a lot of bills have slipped through the cracks, quote unquote, as money bills. What is your view on that?
No, look, I think the finance minister answered this in the best way it can be answered, which is to say, look, I undertake two things. I will discuss, I will debate, deliberate with all parties. And second is I will follow the constitution, diligently. There is not much more that anybody else can say. And I think the government and particularly the finance minister have come around to realizing that the entire let us say, and I've used this phrase DNA again of GST, is that it will only be successful if all political parties are behind it at every step. So I think this consensus building approach to nursing, growing, enlarging the GST will be in place and will be on display for several months, not just yesterday. I think this will be evident to all of us as commentators, as MPs, as citizens. It will be visible to us pretty much for the next 1 or 2 years, because unless everybody is behind this, unless all state governments and political parties are behind this, GST will not succeed. And it is in our interest, all of us, for GST to succeed.
Right. Mr. Chandrasekhar, as far as the same issue is concerned, I mean, Mr. Chidambaram also said that it's still a half promise. How do you think it'll pan out going ahead? I mean, will the members of the Rajya Sabha ultimately get to vote on the bill when it is introduced?
No, I think we will see. We will see that when it comes to Rajya Sabha. I don't see any scenario where the Rajya Sabha does not get to speak its mind and vote on the GST law. I don't see that scenario, because I think that is not a scenario that will help the GST. Forget the government or forget the politics of it. If the GST has to be successful, the same consensus building that we saw yesterday will have to be in display for every step that is being executed and rolled out legislatively over the next 1 year. So I see myself getting back on standing up again and speaking on GST in the winter session, and I see a vote. It is obviously not going to be a constitutional amendment, and so simple majority will be enough, but there will be a discussion in Rajya Sabha and there will be a vote. I don't see any reason why that will not happen.